Welcome back to the sessions, everybody. We recently finished our sessions on the dictatorship of the proletariat according to Marx and Engels. Next up, and before that, we finished the reading of the communist mode of production according to Marx and Engels. More or less anything wherein it directly speaks to that from their own mouths. Now, Marx and Engels didn't speak a particularly massive amount about communism, holding that as the negation of capitalism, and therefore anything that is within communism emerges out of capitalism. As such, from his perspective, not much has to be directly written about it, since it already explains all the characteristics of it within his critique of political economy as a whole. Despite that, we went through and found all the places where he did directly talk about it. And then we talked about what is the working class will need to do to bring about that mode of production, which would be the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now we are going to talk about how it is that the working class might organize to construct this dictatorship of the proletariat that will lead to communism. So we are, in fact, going backwards, for good or ill. But I think that's perhaps a little bit easier to understand if we do that. It's may not the most scientific and proper way of going about it, though. So, though, we have a large number of readings. As everybody should know, any branch of communists should be, from the perspective of economics, a Marxist, in the sense that, Marx specifically. To note, Marxism is not really Marx, it's Marx, Engels, Bebel, and a whole host of things. Lenin came in later and he essentially got rid of a lot of the revisionism that had built up over time after Marx had passed, uh, like with LaSalle and whatnot, uh, within the communist movement. So, all communists should be economically Marxist. However, not all communists are in agreement about how it is the working class should organize to seize political power and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. And we have many distinct formulations. You have, for example, the various branches of left communism. And that would include, for example, the Italian historic branches, and it's not just them, but they recognize the need of a party. They tend to have some form of rejection of democratic organizing and in their turn some iteration of organic centralism or derivative. uh, Damon, for example, not me, Damon, the left communist writer, had something in mind called dialectical centralism, for example. Then you have the Dutch German left communists, whom Lenin criticized in his Left Communism and Infantile Disorder. They hold to spontaneous action, rejection of organizing with legal action in terms of parliamentarism, holding that will effectively harm the ability of the working class to properly organize. And these tend to, in modern time, be some branch of council communists. Then you have the Marxist Leninists, who hold to particular formation of the Vanguard Party, whom the Council Communists and Dutch German left derivatives go for, right? Or are opposed to, excuse me. Sorry, I'm not too prepared for this. I'm just talking right now, not reading off any script. And anyway, Vanguard Party, Democratic Centralism, so on and so forth. Then you have Maoism with its circular formation and so on and so forth, which is a combination of party organization and revolutionary tactics, which, to be fair, is the case for all Marxist revolutionary structures. So, um, that's not all of them. You have anarchist types, you have situationists, which are basically anarchists, you have communizers. The list goes on and on. So, our project here is not specifically to go over all these different iterations. We're going to go through some of the originals, and I'm going to be focusing mostly on Lenin and party related things. That's right, I am backing party formation. I'm backing vanguardism and militant structuring. I'm rejecting spontaneity and so on and so forth. I believe that these things are fundamentally incompatible with modern organizing. That sort of stuff might have worked in the 1850s. But as Engels discussed in the class struggle in France, in his postscript and whatnot to it, conditions change. The bourgeoisie built up formations in order to resist this sort of stuff. They understand what's coming their way, and as a result, they have built up an amount of antibodies to it. We cannot do the same thing. Spontaneous action is unable to result in it. And in fact, that sort of action has resulted in terrible things in the past. It was the leading into that which created the room for fascism to come about, because I don't want to get into it, but the German and Italian failures there were intense. Let's just say that much. To that end, though, we will be going over a variety of different things. A lot of these are very short. They are, sheesh. All these things are very short. Not all of them are, though. They tend to be, for example, a list of things. Like, for example, this International Working Men's Association Provisional Rules. This was the rules for membership within the Internationale, the first one. So, for a full list of our reading, we are going to be going through sections of the Communist Manifesto, the International Working Men's Association for the First Internationale, the provisional rules as Lenin, where to begin. We will be skipping Lenin's was to be done given the time investment. I'm wanting to get through all the shorter stuff first. Then Lenin, layered to a comrade in organizational tasks. Lenin, resolutions on the imperialist war. George Lukács, tactics and ethics. The platform of the Communist International, of the Third International, and the theses on bourgeois democracy and the dictatorship of the proletariat. The theses presented by the Communist abstentionist faction. The manifesto/platform of the party left. Preamble to the statutes in the Third International. Conditions of admission to the Communist International. Theses on the role of the Communist Party in the proletarian revolution. Theses on the national colonial question. And we'll be going through the theses on parliamentarism presented by the Communist abstentionist faction of the ISP. The party program of the Italian Socialist Program. The party and class action of the Communist Party of Italy, section of the Third International. The tactics of the Communist International and the democratic principle. Gorder's open letter to Comrade Lenin. Theses on Tactics and Theses on the Agrarian Question. Report of the Communist Party of Italy on Party Tactics and the Questions of the United Front. Theses presented by the Communist Party of Italy for the 4th Congress of the 3rd Communist Internationale and the Communist Party of Italy Report on Fascism. Draft theses presented by the left on the policies and tasks of the Party of Communists in Italy. In the 5th Congress of the 3rd Internationale, the program of action presented by the left of left of Communist Party of Italy, and then yet another report on fascism by left of Communist Party in Italy. Then the 3rd Congress of Line, theses presented by left. The 6th Enlarged Executive Report by the left of the Communist Party of Italy. Then we move post-World War II, the nature, function, and tactics of the Revolutionary Party of the Working Class, the party platform, the party program, appeal to movement, international reorganization, characteristic theses on the party, proletarian dictatorship and the class party, contributions to the organic historical representation of the Marxist revolutionary theory, fundamentals of revolutionary communism, Kamat's origin and function of the party form, and considerations on the organic activity of the party when the general situation is historically unfavorable, and notes for theses on the question of organization. Then reunion of Naples, theses on historical duty, action, and the structure of the World Communist Party. Reunion of Milan, supplementary theses on the historical tasks, the action, and the structure of the World Communist Party. Then 1974's the Communist Party in the tradition of the left, and Il Partito Comunista, the party does not arise from circles. And finally, party's theses and classical evaluations on imperialist wars. As you can see, this is heavily influenced, this list that I have put together, by left communism of the Italian variety. This is going to be focusing on vanguardism, party construction, the requirements of organization within the party, and so on and so forth. As such, we're not going to be quite yet. This might change if somebody puts forward to me, for example, a strong argument for a particular Maoist text on party formation, for instance. But right now, we're sticking to Lenin and Italian. I'm not planning on getting into any council comm stuff. Though I might read stuff on council organization. If I can get that, I will be very happy. With that said, let's get started for the reading. Today we will be reading excerpts out of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, and if we have time, we'll get through these provisional rules. Let's get started. Okay. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where's the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where's the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. 1. Communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. 2. It is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, to meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. So, Section 1. Bourgeois and Proletarians. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, and manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these cases, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of old feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, to two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burghers of the earliest towns. From these burgesses, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave rise to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby, to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, in which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, no longer suffices for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guildmasters are pushed aside by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between different corporate guilds vanished, the face of division of labor in each single workshop. Meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacturers no longer suffice. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant modern industry, the place of the industrial middle class by industrial millionaires, the leaders of the whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Modern industry has established the world market, for which the discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in turn, reacted on the extension of industry, and in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extended, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increases its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of the long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the mode of production and exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance in that class. An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, an armed and self-governing association of the medieval commune, here independent urban republic as in Italy and Germany, there taxable, quote, third estate of the monarchy as in France, afterward, in the period of manufacturing proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpoise against the nobility, and, in fact, cornerstone of the great monarchies in general. The bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself, in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. I'm actually going to take this for the previous study on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay. The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, whenever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his, quote, natural superiors, and has left no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned out the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of philosophic sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value. In the place of the numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation. Veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. To note here, Marx is not he is making a moral he has a moral position here, but his argument is not based on morality, even if his words are very harsh. To Marx, this is not a good or bad thing, it's a historical thing, and in fact, in many ways, it is a necessary thing. Or not even in many ways. It is a historically necessary thing. Continuing. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked upon with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science, into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil, and reduced the family relation into a mere money relation. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionaries so much admire, found its feigned complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been to first show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing the Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put into shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbances of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All newly formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real condition of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, sell everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionaries, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up in indigenous raw materials, but raw materials drawn from the remotest zones, industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. From the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices, to note, barbarian and civilization here are basically the development of class. So, um, nations that are less developed in terms of class, for example, tribal societies, are considered barbarian in this case simply because they are not bourgeois. The capitalist mode of production at this time is the highest level of class development. He's not making moral condemnation. He's not saying these people are stupid or anything like that. He's talking about their historical development. That's all. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it forces a barbarian's intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, example, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. The idiocy of rural life is, again, he's not making a moral condemnation. There's actually a large bit about this that I had a writing for, but I don't remember where it is. John Bellamy Foster talks about it a lot in, I believe, Marx and the Earth and Anti-Critique. Well, I say a lot. It's not a lot. But he's not saying, rural folk are idiots. Anyway, just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so has it made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeoisie, the East on the West. The bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has agglomerated population, centralized the means of production, and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization. Independent, or but loosely connected provinces, with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation, became lumped together into one nation, with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one custom tariff. This would be the nation state as opposed to the previous feudal state. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electrical telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization or rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? We see, then, the means of production and of exchange, on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up, were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society developed, produced, and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacture industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to burst asunder. They were burst asunder. In other words, the productive forces developed, but the relations of production, the class relations, were a fetter on their further development, but they couldn't stop it from developing. And as such, new ideologies sprung up of the people that could harness that further developed productive forces, and they took political power, and that would be the bourgeoisie. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted in it, and the economical and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property. The society has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange. It's like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of the modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the condition for the existence of the bourgeois and its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crisis that, by their periodical return, put the existence of the entire bourgeois society on its trial, each time more threatening. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seen an absurdity: the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, has cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions by which they are fettered, and so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforcing destruction of mass of productive forces; on the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones, that is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. Okay, this is an important thing right here. Because what it's saying here is that the crises under capitalism caused by its dynamics, principally a crisis of overproduction, are an example of the forces of production outstripping the relations of production. Under such conditions, a revolution in the relations of production is ripe for the rising class. Back to the text. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons: the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, example, capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed, a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. So I'm going to put these in here. The proletariat are the revolutionary class, and they will seize the means of production, and in doing so, create a revolution in the relations of production, producing a new mode of production. There we go. Okay. Back to the text. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for maintenance, for the propagation of his race. That is to say, in this case, the proletariat as a class, as a whole within a given society. Not like your skin color. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. What is more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by the increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of machinery, etc. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers, crowded into the factory, are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, in the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. The less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more the modern industrial industry becomes developed. That is to say, the more machines take over labor, the more modern industry becomes developed. The more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences in age and sex no longer have any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash, than he is set upon by the other portion of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen generally, the handcraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped out in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by the new methods of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle against the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried on by individual laborers, then by the work of people in a factory, then by the operative of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. This would be a trade union. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workmen of the Middle Ages. So this is the instinctual class interests of the proletariat. And these are not necessarily revolutionary, right? In fact, see, they're attacking. Consider, for example, anytime you see, for example, people complaining about AI doing audiobooks like this one, right? They're complaining about the fact that they're going to lose their jobs. Under capitalism, of course, that's an entirely valid complaint because one's existence rests upon their labor. They cannot reproduce themselves without laboring for capitalists, and if that capitalist is getting rid of them, then they need to go back and sell themselves to a new capitalist to survive. But is this revolutionary? No. Is it in their class interests? Yes. So not all proletarian class interests are revolutionary. And that is why any truly revolutionary working class organization needs to fight against such spontaneous and instinctual developments. Rather, we need to constantly be looking at what is actually going to bring about a new relation, not one that is reactionary. See, they're going to go back to a previous age here. Continuing. At this stage, the laborers so form an incoherent mass scattered over the whole country and broken up by their mutual competition. If any were to unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequence of their own active union, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which class, in order to attain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion, and is moreover yet for a time able to do so. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies, the remnants of the absolute monarchy, the landowners, the non-industrial bourgeois, the pay bourgeois. Thus, the whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeoisie. So, what is needed is the proletariat must lead its own movement. The bourgeoisie cannot be allowed to lead the movement of the proletariat. Continuing. But with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows, and it feels its strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized, in proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor, and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises make the wages of workers ever more fluctuating. The increasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations, trade unions, against the bourgeois. They club together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They found permanent associations in order to make provision beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots. So, what's happening here? The proletariat as a class is ideologically and physically developing. As a result, the proletariat are able to go in and recognize their shared class interests and come into communion with one another, right? And they are still fighting within the confines of capitalism. They are fighting for the right to withhold sale of labor power. And that doing so increases their wages because the costs of reproducing labor power are increased. It also takes them out of the more direct forms of competition. Excuse me one second. My nose is itching something fierce. Okay. Now and then the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battles lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. This union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry. In that place, the workers of different localities in contact with one another. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles, all the same character, into one national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle, and that union, to attain which the burghers of the Middle Ages, with their miserable highways, required centuries, the modern proletarian, thanks to railways, achieve in a few years. This organization of the proletarians into a class, and consequently into a political party, is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. It compels legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. Thus, the 10-hour bill in England was carried. Right, so the trade unions end up entering into greater and greater unions. Then the workers find themselves entering into legal struggle against the bourgeoisie. And in that legal struggle against the bourgeoisie, they set the different factions of the bourgeoisie against each other so that they can win greater position and political power. Continuing. Altogether, collisions between the classes of the old society further, in many ways, the course of the development of the proletariat. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself, whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, at all time with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for help, and thus to drag into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. Important to note, this requires the proletariat to have a party of its own, a political organization of its own. Any attempts to, organize within a bourgeois party like the Democratic Party is not doing any of this. Not in the slightest. Continuing. Further, as we have already seen, entire sections of the ruling class are, by the advance of industry, precipitated into the proletariat, or at least threatened in their conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. In other words, bourgeoisie and whatnot, who come from rich families and backgrounds and high education, end up being proletarianized. Then they hopefully will side with the proletariat and develop literature and stuff like that, a la Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels, and help give us the ideological tools for developing the struggle. Continuing. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the progress of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact with the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its own hands. Just as, therefore, an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, a particular portion of the bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. Later down, and we won't be reading this, Marx talks about these bourgeois socialists. Any bourgeois coming into the communist movement needs to engage in serious theoretical development and critique, else they end up essentially social democrats. Just be aware of that. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a genuinely revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower and middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary, but conservative. Nay, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, it is only so in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present, but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat. The, quote, dangerous class, the social scum, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of the old society, may here and there be swept into the movement by the proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepared for far more for the bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. He's talking about the lumpen proletariat. Lumpen proletariat is not necessarily, reactionary, but sections of it have a tendency to align with whoever's just going to assure their existence for the next day. They are short-termists and whatnot. To note, Marx considers, for example, widows as lumpen proletariat, to give example of the fact that not all lumpen proletariat are, scum of the earth or anything like that. Anyway, it's rather that society turns these people into social scum. It's not a moral condemnation. Continuing. In the condition of the proletariat, those of old society at large are already virtually swamped. The proletarian is without property. His relation to his wife and children has no longer anything in common with bourgeois family relations. Modern industry labor, modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped of him every trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. All the preceding classes that got the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation. The proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities or the interests of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the immense interests of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum in our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. So, let's look at this sentence for a little bit. Proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interests of the immense majority. In other words, it is an independent movement by the proletariat for the proletariat. And this immense majority are self-conscious. They recognize their own interests. They are educated on what their purpose is. This is part of the role of the party. The party needs to educate. It needs to remain independent. It needs to be made up of proletarians and led by the proletariat. Back to the text. Though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. Okay? In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we trace a more or less veiled civil war, ranging within existing society up to the point where that war breaks out in an open revolution, where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays a foundation for the sway of the proletariat. Hitherto, every foreign society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can, at least, continue its slavish existence. In the serf, in the period of serfdom, raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the pay bourgeois under the yoke of feudal absolutism managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the process of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society, and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within its slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. The essential conditions for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of laborers due to competition by the revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie, therefore, produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Okay, lots of useful stuff in there. We're going to continue and read the first part of part 2 and then through part 4, which is very short. Continuing. Part 2, Proletarians and Communists. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own, by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only. 1. In the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat independently of all nationality, in other words, internationalism. 2. In the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. In other words, under different national conditions, right? You might need to have you'll need to pass through several layers of development. In modern times, there's no need for this. It's so fully developed that's there are countries out there that if they had a seizure of political power by the working class, that they would need to do intense industrialization and some form of new economic policy. But most countries in modern day don't have that. Okay. Back to the text. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the lines of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletariat movement. In other words, we know where we're going, we know how to get there, and we're the most advanced ideologically, and so on and so forth. And we seek to educate the masses so that they can independently come to their own conclusions. We're not out here to take control of the movement or anything like that. That would not work. Continuing. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties. Formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express, in general terms, actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. The abolition of existing property relations is not all a distinctive feature of communism. Okay. Taking this. Taking this. All property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change, consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as a fruit of man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Actually, we're going to skip this part. He is responding to various criticisms of communism, which is nice and all, but we are looking for this particular thing. So we are going to scroll down. 1 second. Here we go. But let's have done with the bourgeois objections to communism. We have seen above that the first step in the revolution of the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state. Example of the proletariat organized as a ruling class to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. This is still the dictatorship of the proletariat. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production. By means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrips themselves, necessitates further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. In other words, while we can learn from these measures, don't apply them in modernity. This is for a particular time and a particular place. Many of these have been actually won in varying degrees, but then brought to bourgeois formulations of it as best as it can. Okay. 1. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. This would kind of be like So no, never mind. We don't actually have a country that has this. I was about to say Georgism, but then no, Georgism retains property and land. Um, and now I was about to say, well, China doesn't have really private land ownership. You kind of rent land from the state, but the the proceeds of that rent don't go back to the public. So yeah. Anyway, 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. I want to note that in a letter Marx wrote, he said that really immediately pushing this, especially with the peasantry, would be reactionary in character. These are essentially Marx's take in order to agitate based on and pressure the bourgeoisie within the legal form and to propagandize. So, yeah. 4, yeah, these things will not. These things will take a lot of time, even within the dictatorship of the bourgeois or of the proletariat. Continuing. 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Immigrants are people who move away, not people who move to your country. 5, centralization of credit in the banks of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan. 8, equal obligation of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by more equal distribution of the populace over the country. And there's actually a lot more that goes into this division of town and country, but I won't get into that because then I will speak for probably 10 minutes. 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production, etc. Okay. I just put that, and then delete. Oops. There we go. Within the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared, and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation. The public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat during its conquest of the bourgeoisie is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if, by means of revolution, it makes up the ruling class and, as such, sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In the place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is a condition for the free development of all. Okay. So, we are going to skip this section where Marx talks about the different stances of communism, and he's attempting to essentially bring them all together, and he criticizes them all and says, hey, you guys should become proper communists, not these utopian socialists or bourgeois socialists, etc. We are going to skip down to section 4, the position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. Section 2 has made clear the relations of the communists to the existing working class parties, such as the Chartists in England and the agrarian reformers in America. The communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class. But in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement. In France, the communists ally with the Social Democrats against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, reserving, however, the right to take up a critical position in regard to phases and illusions traditionally handed down from the Great Revolution. Anti-sectarianism, in other words. They want to be able to agitate within these parties for communism when they are working with them. If they won't let you agitate within them, then don't ally with them. There's no point. So, footnote by Engels, the 1888 English edition. The party then represented in Parliament by Ledru Rollin and literature by Louis Blanc, 1811 to 82. The daily press by the Reform. The name social democracy signifies, with these its inventors, a section of the Democratic or Republican Party more or less tinged with socialism. Back to the text. In Switzerland, they support the radicals, without losing sight of the fact that this party consists of antagonistic elements, partly of democratic socialists, in the French sense, partly of radical bourgeois. In Poland, they support the party that insists on an agrarian revolution as a prime condition for national emancipation, that party which fomented the insurrection of Krakow in 1846. In Germany, they fight with the bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way against the absolute monarchy, the feudal squirearchy, and the pay bourgeoisie. But they never cease for a single instance to instill in the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat, in order that the German workers may straightwise use, as so many weapons against the bourgeoisie, the social and political conditions that the bourgeoisie must necessarily introduce along with its supremacy, in order that, after the fall of the reactionary classes in England, the fight against the bourgeoisie itself may immediately begin. And this, by the way, carried out. It's just that the fight failed, unfortunately. The communists turned their attention chiefly to Germany, because that country is on the eve of a bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization. As to say, it's a highly developed industrial society. And with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th, and France in the 18th century. And because of the bourgeois revolution in Germany, will be but the prelude to an immediate following proletarian revolution. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In these movements, they bring to the front, as a leading question in each, the property question, no matter what its degree of development at that time. Finally, they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. The communists sustain to conceal their views and aims. They declare openly that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. And that is all the sections that we will be reading through. I do highly recommend that you read this section, Socialist and Communist Literature. It's a very good thing. You'll see most of these very often still. Some of these really just took a beating. You don't really see utopian socialism all that much anymore, besides in the most bleak form. Nobody really calls themselves that. It used to be people would regularly call themselves that. You don't see this conservative socialism in this sense, right? Essentially people who are wanting to return to the feudal order, but a nicer feudal order. this can be pretty much the socialism of the intellectuals, kind of. Um, and you do see that every so often, but not so much. Feudal socialism, of course, not a thing. You do see pay bourgeois socialism a lot. Anyway, so I'm going to close off this recording and open up the next one in just a few. That was the reading of the Communist Mode of Production for the working class organization, which will bring about the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay.